Sarah and my father's support through my father's struggle, whether it was in the form of well wishes or participating in a meal train or just having my father in your thoughts. I'd like to thank individually a few people, and I don't mean to leave anybody out, but these are the people that I've had the most contact with during my visits over this period. I'd like to thank Mark and Maine for their kind hospitality and for letting us overrun their house every time we show up at the family compound. I'd like to thank Jerry for his spiritual guidance and for being a good friend to my father. I'd like to thank, of course, Brother Lynn and Don for just always being there. You treated my father and Sarah like family, and therefore I'll always consider you family in my heart. And I'd like to thank my brothers for being here when I could not. I'd finally like to thank Sarah. Your demonstration of love, support, strength, and utter devotion to my father over his time was unparalleled. Marrying you was probably the best decision we ever made. My father was many things. He was a husband, a father, a journalist, a gardener, a hunter, a fisherman, a horseman, an optimist. I'll tell you a story that I probably shouldn't because we're in church, but when I was about 15, I was in the garage fixing a bicycle with a screwdriver, and I somehow managed to poke myself in the eye with it. So my father rushed me to the ER room over this basketball. My eye was so full of blood that I was blind in one eye, and I couldn't see. And my father drove me over, he turned to me and he said, "You know, son, you're probably going to have to wear an eye patch for the rest of your life." 15, I reacted in horror. But he pondered it for a little while. He looked at me and he said, "But you know what? It's going to get you laid." I don't know if that's true. It made me feel better. I had this actually on a work here. I don't know what I saw in high school. It'll work for the time. My father often claimed to be antisocial, believe it or not. He was about the friendliest and most outgoing antisocial person. In his youth, he was a poet and a photographer. Then he became a cowboy. And he settled later in life into being an Indian. He liked to say he was a country boy from Ypsilanti, Michigan. You know, I've been to Ypsilanti, and I never saw any country there, but I've learned that it was a different place in the 1950s. And my father often talked about hunting squirrels and fishing in the woods behind the family home. But my father really was, in essence, a con man. And the angle he was working his entire life was not how to get money out of people's pocket, but how to get much of his life outside as possible to be in the natural world. My father's cousin Greg, who is sitting here today, told us a pretty funny story of the time when my father had a brief episode where he lived in San Diego with his Aunt Mary. And it was between journalism gigs, and he drove a cab. And so Greg said one day, he asked him what that was like, how was the business of driving a cab? My father admitted that he didn't actually drive the cab that much. He would go out every day, make enough money to pay for gas and whatever the rental fee was, and then he'd go fishing all day. And he did this for many weeks. And I can personally tell you that the real inspiration for a great number of my father's news stories was the proximity of a fishing stream he wanted to hit, or a hillside he wanted to hunt. That was often the inspiration of the articles he read. And it's not really correct to say that my father loved nature. It was more that he could not survive without nature. He couldn't be who he was without being in and near to the natural world. It was part of his essence, part of his identity, and it was the only place where he could truly be free from the social constraints of the man-made world. And he would just get depressed after spending too much time out of the country. And like a fish out of water, he always needed to submerge himself back into the trees and fields so that he could breathe. And I'd like to think that the people of Mountain Wolf were always giving him a place where he could breathe. He loved that place like no other on earth. My father taught me many things. He taught me to hunt and fish, although I'll never be able to do those things as well as he could. And to be honest, his straight-out obsession with fishing in the 1980s pretty much tore me off to it forever. My sister Cree and I were permanently scarred by his insistence on stopping at every body of water more than a foot wide, and throw a few casts in a few minutes. Always took hours. And we'd stand there captive, shivering, miserable and cold, as the darkness fell, on some muddy bank of some muddy river. But I always loved hunting with my father, and we spent many hours sitting in the woods, just watching the trees as the birds would sing overhead. He was great at hunting and fishing because he had the ability to see things in nature that others missed. He could read the water in a way that I could not, always knowing where a fish would be hiding. And even while driving around this area, he would constantly scan the fields and woods, pointing at a wild turkey here, a deer there, a coyote in those rocks. And half the time, I never even saw them. He taught me that you can talk to trees. And when in the woods, he'd often stop at a grand oak or a redwood, rest his palm on it, and give it greetings. He taught me that trees and everything else in nature has a spirit. He taught me that the Great Spirit was everywhere and in everything. He thanked the spirits of all the deer he took from this world. He taught me that man's role is to steward the earth and not destroy it. He gave me my first lesson in environmental conservation in 1977 when I was about 6 or 7. We were up in Leggett in Mendocino County. His friend Joe had a big campsite up there, and I was about 6, and I was just wandering through the campsite one day, and there was a group of older boys who were stoning a snake to death. It was a big rat snake, and they took their rocks and they were just pelting it until it lay still and was dead. And when I got back to our campsite, I told my father about it, and he looked at me and he said, "That's a horrible thing, son." And he proceeded to tell me that if all the snakes were gone, the mice and rodents and vermin would overrun California, eat all the seeds, and the whole place would be just deforested, and it'd be like Sahara Desert. Everything's interconnected. So that was the first of many lectures. It continued up into his last days. I can say that many of the fondest memories of my life took place outside with my father. Many of them on Mountain Wolf. I remember my cousin Aaron, my sister Cree, and I laying in the bed of my dad's pickup. We used to lay on a foam mattress under sleeping bags as we drive up the California coast at night, watching the stars. It was a different time, nobody cared about safety. And Sarah and my dad would be up in the cab with the heat on. But we loved it, we did, we loved it. It was always an adventure with my father. I remember hunting as a teenager with him and his friends in the Sonoma Hills, riding horses up through foggy stands of redwoods, intertubing down the Eel River and kayaking down the Russian River, camping by rivers and lakes. And through these experiences, the natural world also became a part of me, a necessity for me, and I thank my father for this, for learning to love the outdoors and for being able to feel its power and spirit, for learning where to find absolute freedom. The hardest part of losing a father, or anybody, I guess, is the permanence of it. you'll never see this person or speak to this person again. And I've talked to friends over the past week who have also lost fathers, and they've all said the same thing, and that's that while the loss is hard, you realize your father lives on through you in many small ways, and in the things you've learned from your father and you can teach your children, and your love for the same things. And I've come to realize that I make some of the same corny jokes. I make pancakes the way he taught me. He taught me I had to change tires on a car and change the spark plugs, just things like that. And ancestors live on through their descendants in many ways, and mostly in taught values and in taught ways of seeing the world. I never knew my grandfather. He died when I was an infant, and I've always wished that I could have known him. And likewise, what saddens me the most now is knowing that my children will probably not remember the great and grand character that was my father. And I know that their lives are at a loss for this. And that not only was my father robbed of many years, and Sarah robbed of a husband, and his brothers robbed of a brother, and my brothers and sisters robbed of a father, and my cousins robbed of an uncle. But my sons have been robbed of a man who have greatly enriched their lives. But I take solace in knowing that I can teach my sons many of the things that my father taught me, and that while we cannot ever see him again or talk to him, I can when I'm back in New Hampshire where I have a home. I can round up the boys, as I often do, buckle them up in their snowsuits and take them out walking through the snow into the woods. And after a while, we can find a fine old white birch or maybe a strong maple. And we can sit in the snow with our backs leaning against the tree. And we'll sit there in silence, and as the wind whistles through the branches above, we'll feel the presence of my Father's Spirit all around us. And after a while, we'll say,